In the name of God, hello everybody. This is session 11 of your discourse analysis lesson. As you know, in the previous session, I talked about, the cohesive markers between sentences, and one by one, I started to talking about some terms which shows this kind of connectivity. The first term is reference. And as you know, I talked about the reference. Reference itself has many subtypes. One of those, types of subtypes of reference is endophora. As you know, endophorical reference instructs the hearer or reader to look inside, you see here, the text to find what is being referred to. So endophoric reference is a kind of reference which the reader looks inside the text to find what is being referred to. The initial referring expression enable the reader to refer to that expression which he knows about from general knowledge. The implication is that, however far into the text the reader reads, subsequently reference to that expression must always be resolved by going back through the chain of reference to the original expression, which alone has the power to allow the reader to escape from the text and relate what he is reading about to the real world. You see here, if there is a kind of, for example, pronoun, and I ask you about the reference of that pronoun, you should going back through the text to find the reference of the the pronoun, and find the real reference in the real word. So this view is easy for small chunks of text, so we can look back to find the reference. But what we have done about long text, if we have a kind of long text, we cannot go back to find the reference of the pronoun. So we can say that hearers would retain in memory, you see here, the original expression. So we should save the reference in our memory. Okay, so we shall suggest that it seems more likely that the processor establishes a referent in his mental representation of the discourse and relates subsequent references to that referent back to his mental representation rather than to the original verbal expression in the text. So if you have a long text, it's difficult to come back to find a reference of the pronoun. So we should save in our mind, in our mental, in our memory, the reference. So if we look, if we see a kind of pronoun, we come back to that mental representation, not real verbal expression. If this view is correct, the distinction between endophoric and exophoric coreference becomes much harder to draw. You see, we have two kinds of reference: endophoric, which the reference is inside the text, and exophoric, which the reference is from outside, from the world. So in both cases, endophoric and exophoric, we must suppose the processor has a mental representation. We have a kind of mental representation in our mind for the reference of the pronoun. In one case, he has a mental representation of what is in the world. In other, he has a mental representation of a world created by the discourse. Okay, in each case he must look into his mental representation to determine reference. Okay, this is about long text. If we have small chunks of the text, it is easy to find the reference. We come back to find the reference. But if we have a kind of long text, this is difficult to come back to find a reference. So we should have a kind of mental representation to be a reference of the, for example, pronoun. So this is a kind of reference. The other term which shows a kind of connectivity and cohesion in the text, it's substitution. Okay, what is substitution? Halliday and Hassan adopt a very straightforward model of co-reference. They assume a simple substitution view where an expression may simply be replaced by another in the text. For example, look at the example: wash and core 6 cooking apples, put them into a fireproof dish. You see here, these are two sentences which are related to each other. In the second sentence we have a kind of pronoun them. This them substitute is a kind of substitution for 6 cooking apples. So you see here there is a kind of replacement or substitution. This pronoun a kind of substitution for the 6 cooking apples. But there is a question. We have to ask whether the expression them, this pronoun in the second sentence, really simply refers to the 6 cooking apples in the first sentence. This is a kind of, is there a kind of simple replacement of substitution? The pronoun just simply replace the 6 cooking apples expression? It's our question. Actually, they have undergone a change of state, you see here. Whereas in the first sentence, as you see here, the apples is a kind of pristine apples, straight from the supermarket. But in the second, they are washed, cored. So the description has changed. Okay, this in the second sentence, the description of the apples has changed, you see here. So we can say that the reappearance of identified entities with different description attached to them does suggest that we need some model of processing which allows entity to accumulate properties or change or to change state as a discourse progress. So when the discourse progresses, the state of the nouns has changed. So in the first sentence, they are a kind of pristine apples, which we buy from the supermarket. But in the second sentence, these apples has a kind of change in their state. They are washed and cored, for example. So this is the substitution is is not a simple expression. There are some changes in the state of the nouns. So the following two examples are presented to demonstrate that substitution cannot take place on a strict replacement of an anaphoric form by an antecedent. So substitution isn't a kind of simple term and simple expression. Such a replacement would have to take place under a constraint of syntactic identity. So the adjective, for example, anecdotal in one will not fit the slot occupied by the proform one. For example, look at the example: the child may set the pace. Since the literature is mostly anecdotal, we don't mind offering one of our own. Again, you see here a kind of substitution. One substitutes from the anecdotal. In the following example, for example, we must assume that it is an act of vandalism which should be reported. For example, stop bus vandals by reporting it at once, you see, to the driver or conductor. Again, it is a kind of substitution for act of vandalism. You see here, there are a kind of change of states in the words. So substitution, again, as I told you, it's not a kind of simple term, but we have a kind of change of state of the words. It is, however, only fair to point out that Halliday and Hassan are not concerned to produce a description which accounts for how texts are understood. They are rather concerned to examine the linguistic resources available to the speaker, writer to mark cohesive relationships. Their examination of these linguistic resources is rich, interesting, and insightful. So this is the term, reference. As you see here, the term reference is not a kind of simple term, but there are a kind of change of state in the words during the progressing of the discourse. So we should attention look to this change of state in the words. So this is another term. I want to talk about another expression which shows a kind of cohesion. Excuse me. So this is the substitution which I talked about it. The other term which I want to talk about it is discourse reference. Okay, this is another term which needs a cohesion and connectivity to show this kind of term, discourse reference. The traditional semantic view of reference, as you know about reference, is one in which the relationship of reference is taken to hold between expression in a text and entities in the word. This is the traditional view. If I ask you about the term reference, maybe you say that it's a relationship between expression in a text and entities in the word. This is, we call it reference, and that of co-reference between expressions in different parts of a text. Or maybe, as you see, there is a kind of co-reference relationship between parts of a text. In traditional approach, the term reference is used together with sense to discuss lexical meaning. If I ask you, for example, about the lexical meaning, maybe you say that the lexical meaning is composed of its sense and reference. Each lexical meaning has a kind of sense, its definition, as has a kind of reference. Refer back to the real word. You see, it's often considered important in formal semantics that the expression used to refer to an entity must in its description be true of that entity. So the reference of that, when we look for reference of the entity, that entity should be true first of all. For example, we say the King of England. This expression is a kind of true event in the world. There is a kind of King of England. So first of all, the expression should be true. In fact, it need not even be the case that the speaker believes the description to be true, but rather he believes that by using this expression, he will enable his hearer to pick out the intended reference. For example, this example, the King of England, there should be two principle here. First of all, this expression should be true, the King of England, and the second one is that the reader should know that his hearer can recognize this reference, okay, and know this reference, the King of England. So we should obey these two kind of principles. Thus, the concept which interests the discourse analysis is not that just correct or true reference, but successful reference. You see here, we call these two kind of principles as successful reference. First, this expression is true, and second, the reader knows that the hearer can recognize the reference of the expression. So we call it successful reference. Successful reference depends on the hearers identifying for the purposes of understanding the current linguistic message the speaker's intended referent on the basis of the referring expression used. This last point introduces the notion of identifying the speaker's intended referent. So we call it identifying the speaker's intended referent, which is, of crucial importance in any consideration of in the interpretation of referring expression in discourse. So in discourse reference, as I told you, in discourse reference, as I told you, there are two principles. First of all, the expression should be true, for example, the King of England, and the reader should know that the hearer can recognize the reference. So we call this process successful reference, and we should obey these two kind of principles, and then we can identify the speaker's intended reference. Reference and discourse representation. So what's the relationship between reference and discourse representation? An analytic distinction can be made between what is in the world and what we might describe as the representation in the mind of a person of what is in the world. These latter concepts we can treat as the individual's representation or model of the world. So when a writer, for example, or a speaker produces a piece of discourse, it will be based on his individual representation of a particular state of affairs. The reader or hearer, as he receives the discourse, will normally try to build a representation, his model of the state of affairs. You see here, first, the speaker or writer produces a piece of discourse based on his individual representation or her individual representation. Then the hearer, receives the discourse, listen it, okay? So the hearer again try to build the representation based on his, model and his, again, individual representation. So each person, understand a piece of, text and discourse based on his or her individual representation and mental representation. So each of us, based on our experience, our general knowledge, and many other factors, all of us may interpret the discourse and the text based on our individual and mental representation. Both the writer and the speaker, and again the reader and the hearer, and all of us do it. So this is the relationship between two kind of terms. So however, this basic version should allow us to see that there is likely to be an inherent mismatch. You see, sometimes there is a kind of mismatch between, for example, the speaker and the reader, between what is the speaker's representation and what is the hearer's representation. A strong version of this view would be that humans understand what is said to them in terms of their own knowledge and beliefs about the world. All of us, you see, all of us understand what is said to us in terms of our own knowledge, okay, and our beliefs about the world. So maybe there are, kind of mismatches between us, between these kind of understanding, because, each of us have a kind of special knowledge, special beliefs about the world, so we are different from each other. So maybe, sometimes there is a kind of mismatch between, us as a speaker, as a hearer, When a speaker, on the basis of his representation, uses an expression to pick out an individual entity, he will typically take into consideration those features of his hearers developing discourse representation, which he can depend on the hearers being able to use in identifying the intended referent. The assumption of for example, the assumption of the similar general experience. If we have a kind of same experience of the world, or maybe same sociocultural convention, or awareness of a context, or communicative convention, these help us to understand each other. So when we live, for example, in the same country, in the same culture, in the same society, maybe we have a kind of same experience, same beliefs, same, knowledge. So these kind of samenesses help us to understand each other and to solve, I mean, those mismatches as I told you. For example, look at this example. I say to you, for example, my uncle's coming home from Canada. You see here, because I know that, for example, you know that I have an uncle. So just I mean, I don't say I have an uncle and then my uncle is coming home from Canada. Just to say my uncle is coming home from Canada, because as a speaker, I know that you know that I have an uncle. For the hearer, so there may only be an identity in terms of the individual referred to as the speaker's uncle. It means according to the referring expression which is used by expression. So this is, I mean, the discourse reference. And as I told you, there should be two, I mean, principle. First, the expression should be true, and second, the speaker knows that the hearer can identify the reference, so we call it successful reference, as I told you. And then I talked about the reference and discourse representation. Again, I told you we as a human being have, I mean, may have different knowledge, different experiences, so maybe there are kind of mismatches between, I mean, us, but the same person, I mean, in the same society, because of the same experience, same cultural, I mean, beliefs or knowledge, maybe we can solve those mismatches. For example, like this example. Okay, this is the relationship between reference and discourse, I mean, the discourse representation. And that's enough for today. Okay, thank you for your attention, everybody, and goodbye.